Welcome to Module 1, Before Bitcoin. Did you know that Bitcoin wasn't the first attempt at digital money? Of course, we start off each module with all of the Florida standards connection, looking at the various benchmarks that are met through the content that can be delivered through this particular module. Of course, this comes across from computer science to personal finance, social studies, and there's always going to be financial literacy and digital currency tie-ins throughout all of the modules. Now, when we talk about the factors of production in traditional social studies contexts, normally we think about land, labor, and capital. In the blockchain digital world, this takes a slightly different form. When we talk about land, the corollary would be finite block space that's on a network bandwidth and in a given particular blockchain. If we're talking about labor, that's the computational work from miners or perhaps validators on proof of stake networks, and the code that comes from developers. Then, of course, we have the capital, the money that's infused in the original investment, going into things like specialized hardware, such as ASICs for mining proof of work chains, or maybe servers for proof of stake networks. And then, of course, the staked digital assets themselves count as capital. And entrepreneurship is innovation in building new decentralized protocols and applications. You'll notice at the bottom of this one that we have what's called a benchmark spotter. Throughout many of the modules, you will see these spotters that call out a particular benchmark within social studies that applies to this particular slide. Now, the context in the pre-Bitcoin world would have been in the 1980s and 90s, the internet was very new. Of course, online shopping was extremely risky, credit card fraud was common, and then early digital money experiments aimed at privacy and security to fix some of these early internet problems. So these are just a quick glance at many of the attempts that existed before Bitcoin, and we're going to delve into them in a little bit in depth. You'll see another benchmark spotter down below. But let's dig into each of them. DigiCash was founded by David Chaum, and it was used eCash, which were anonymous cryptographic payments. The example was to buy things online without having to share ID. The failure, however, came from the problem of it being too centralized, meaning that there was really just one owner for this entire network, and there was low adoption. It didn't really succeed or get off the ground, and eventually, DigiCash went bankrupt in 1998. So it was a great idea for those anonymous online payments, but it has a challenge, and you'll see that with each of them. eGold was a slightly different take. This was created by Douglas Jackson, and it was backed by physical gold. Gold was actually deposited, and then loans were taken against it that was able to fund these instant microtransactions. There were millions of accounts and nearly $2 billion in yearly volume. However, because of the weak oversight and the illegal activity that was happening on there, the government eventually stepped in and shut it down in 2008. So the lesson is that without regulation and legal compliance, you need that in order for these financial systems to survive, something that we're seeing here in 2026 with the discussion of the Clarity Act at the federal government level. Other attempts included things such as B-Money, which was in 1998 created by Wei Dai, and it was a decentralized concept. It never launched. And then BitGold in 1998, which was promoted by Nick Szabo, an early proponent of Bitcoin, and it had a mining-like idea that eventually went into Bitcoin's creation. So both of these inspired Bitcoin's design. Now, why they failed, they have some central themes. Centralization is always going to be a huge problem. It's controlled by one group. There's no trust because there were frauds and there were hacks. And then ultimately, there was low adoption. There simply weren't enough users for these networks for them to continue to exist. So if you're thinking about past technologies and you're doing this lesson in a classroom with your students, this is something that you could have, just a conversation with them about, what is the early skeptics, what do early skeptics say? What are the challenges that arise? Think about who key innovators or supporters may be. And then how did it change society? What helped it move from the niche over to the mainstream? And one of the things that you will see consistently throughout all of them is that there's a compression of time when it comes to adoption of new technology. As our world takes on speed, things get adopted faster and faster. So, a great first example, of course, is the printing press, which debuted in the 1440s when Gutenberg created movable type. Now, very early on, as you can imagine, the clergy and the elites did not want this to proliferate because giving wide literacy to everybody meant that they no longer had that centralized authority over knowledge. By the 1500s, you had cheaper books, especially starting with Bibles, of course, with the Protestant Reformation, and then it started to see an increase in literacy. By the 16 and 1700s, newspapers and mass media was starting to proliferate as well. And by 1800s, printing had hit the mainstream, so it was essential to knowledge sharing. Now, the resistance again came from these early critics and skeptics, but you'll see through all of these examples, they were overcome in due time. So when you think about electricity, this is another good example. You'll notice the shortening window. Earlier, with the printing press, it took from the 1440s up until the 1800s, literally 400 years later before we had mass adoption. Now we'll see this compressed to roughly a century with the spread of electricity. In 1870s, Edison and Tesla pioneer electric power. In the 1880s and 90s, we have a gradual rollout, first to factories and then eventually to homes, especially again for the wealthy that could afford it. By the 1920s and 40s, you had rapid adoption in homes and industries. And then by the 1950s, electricity, for the most part, becomes pretty universal infrastructure that spans across the world, and especially in Western developed societies. Internet adoption, you'll see again that same compression of time, where we start in the 1960s and 80s with a very small dedicated network called the ARPANET, which was the predecessor to the internet. This connected military installations as well as research universities. By the 1990s, the World Wide Web was born and public adoption began to gain steam. In the 2000s, we had broadband, e-commerce, search engines, and this is when the internet starts to change into what we call Web 2.0, where it became much more interactive. By the 2010s, we see the rise of applications and the fundamental changing nature of the internet as we know it. So we have smartphones, global connectivity, and of course, making everything essential and reliant upon the internet. And in the early days, you can even Google and find articles from newspapers at the turn of the 21st century in the early 2000s where people were still wondering, is the internet a fad? Is this going to go away? So smartphone adoption, an even faster timeline, of course, from the 1990s, you have early mobile phones and PDAs, to 2007, truly a watershed moment with the launch of the iPhone, where you didn't have a physical keyboard and really changed the design of how smartphones would look. By 2010s, again, we see the launching of many famous apps, whether that's going to be things like Instagram, Facebook, or a lot of the social media that we use today, and it becomes a mobile-first culture. Today, over 6 billion users worldwide have some sort of smartphone. And originally, it was seen as too expensive and frivolous and something that people wouldn't use. So the takeaway is that early failures prove digital money needs to be 1, user-friendly, 2, secure, 3, legally sound. Bitcoin learned these lessons and succeeded by combining decentralization, privacy, and incentives. And we'll talk about that in Module 2. Again, if you're in classroom with students or if you're a parent at home working with your children directly, here are some great activities that you could use to kind of cement the learning if you taught this as a traditional lesson.